Now let's get straight to that big discussion and story in South Africa. And we say, of course, welcome to Claude Bassiak. He is a political economist with Unomics. Claude, we want to shift the discussion from the announcement of Anglo to the political reaction and potential fallout that's happened as a consequence of the announcement. We've seen the Minister, Susan Shabangu, reacting very angrily, saying that she's not been consulted. We see the African National Congress saying that this move is cynical and it's deliberate, and calling in fact for the rendering of Anglo Platinum's license. Was this expected? Is this how everyone expected 2013 to open, given the fact that the ruling party has just elected a new leadership?
Yes and no. Happy New Year to you. And yes, a difficult start of the year already after a very difficult 2012. I think it would have been somewhat naive to expect that there would be no fallout from the necessary restructuring of the mining industry, and particularly the platinum industry. Let's be serious. This is expected. I mean, we knew that Amplats was going to come up with some pretty dramatic announcement and measures. They had announced it in February last year. They were reviewing their business because of the fact that simply it is not making the kind of return that it needs to be making to justify being in operation. And we knew that the strikes only made that situation particularly more difficult. So it would be somewhat disingenuous and naive, I think, on the part of all the parties, Labour, government, ruling party, to be surprised by that. Maybe the scope, maybe the timing, you know, indeed could. But really the reality is that the industry has no choice but to restructure.
We'll come back to the questions of the driving factors for that restructuring, which you say, of course, has been signalled long before the decision has now been taken. Minister Susan Shabangu saying very clearly that she feels, as the regulator, that they were not consulted, and that the announcement by Mr. Griffiths was that they will go and talk to Labour. And this morning on one of the radio stations, she was very adamant that what about the state? When is Anglo Platinum going to be speaking, to the state? Is she justified in her outrage at not being consulted?
You know, it's a difficult one, and I think you can take the PR, public relation, political management elements of that, and one can possibly say, well, yes, it should have been consulted, particularly in this difficult context environment, where undoubtedly there is a political fallout because of the crisis, because of the difficult situation of the South African economy. One can understand, to some extent, the frustration with that. But I think the reaction is overblown. The threats are potentially dangerous. They are certainly counterproductive in terms of what South Africa needs right now. It is part of that escalation in a never-ending crisis in a sector that does not need any more crises. Now, obviously, all parties are going to accuse the other of being responsible for that. But no, let's be reasonable stakeholders and shareholders of the mining industry in South Africa. And let's move back from this kind of heightened level of rhetoric and tit-for-tat escalation. I mean, that's the big concern. This is doing no good to South Africa whatsoever. And I think politically, one has to be able to manage this responsibly as the DMR. There is much bigger at stake than just what Amplats is doing there. There are other mining companies that are going to have to restructure, and they are going to find this highly concerning and make it a lot more difficult for them to do what they must do. Because, Karima, the reality is that they have to go through this restructuring.
But of course we can debate the extent of that restructuring, the scale of it, and of course also the impact on the South African economy, particularly as it relates to potential job losses. Figures bandied about speaks about 14,000 jobs. In a community, if we're taking the Platinum Belt as the geographic area where these job losses are going to hit, that's already economically depressed. Is there something different that Anglo Plats could have done to mitigate some of the social and in the long term political risk factors that a job loss of something like 14,000 jobs in an area like that can have?
Yeah, I mean, and they've announced that they are going to make some compensatory measures, that they are going to try to create one job for a job loss through their, social responsibility plans, their social investments, and so on and so forth. Obviously, it's not the same thing. Obviously, losing 14, 15,000 hardcore professionals in an area like Rustenburg is a very big blow for the economy. And you have to look at the indirect impact of those losses. For every direct mining job in this country, there's a number of indirect mining jobs, directly to the supply chain, and providers of equipment, to the communities and the purveyors of services, to the workers, and so on and so forth. So the cost is staggering, there's no doubt about it. But for me, the key problem is that as long as we allow our cost, labor cost, and our electricity cost to escalate out of control without some sort of a productivity pact, without some sort of a vision for the mining industry in South Africa, and instead of that we take those oppositional routes, all we're doing is we're making the restructuring more and more necessary and more crisis born. And that's the problem. So obviously we need to find some sort of a solution where all the parties come together. Nobody wants to divest, nobody wants to take those measures, but the reality is that mining is about business, mining is about return on investment.
But I think there is a point to be made, Claude, about the fact that mining in South Africa cannot also just be about extractive industries. It cannot be a zero-sum game in many instances. That economies all over the world need to begin to initiate very thorough beneficiation programs. It needs to have a much more sustainable approach to dealing with the sector. Is there enough in the restructuring plan of Anglo Plats that indicates that they are aware of those realities?
I can't comment on that because I haven't seen the details of that, and I would not want to speculate on that. I agree with you about the overall necessity to make mining more beneficial. In all of Africa, that's true. In a lot of other continents, it's true. In South Africa to some extent, but I mean, South Africa is different. Come on, we're looking at the statistics now. South African mining has created a massive amount of value added for the communities and the countries for a long time, lots of jobs. And I think there's a tendency to underestimate that. So certainly there's been super profits in the past few years, but those super profits have tended to be negated by the cost inflation that we've seen and the fact that the international economic outlook is somewhat dim right now. That conversation about sharing the rent more effectively was probably more appropriate around 2005, 2006. Right now we're talking about saving the mining industry in South Africa. I think that's where the conversation needs to be. Is there room for better beneficiation? Yes. And we've been having those conversations, but that we have to have the right policy environment for that. We have to have the right microeconomic environment. If you can't mine because your costs are too high, how in heaven are you going to beneficiate?
Now, if we're talking about the rhetoric, for lack of a better word, well, let's talk about the responses, certainly from the minister. Yes. She has certainly indicated that there might very well be consequences for Anglo Plat in light of the decision that they've taken. And if we look at the ruling party, the African National Congress's response, talking about possibly, looking at the licensing issues. And of course, that elevates the discussion and escalates it to the kind of brinkmanship that everyone is trying to walk away from. Yes. We've last seen that kind of reaction when the nationalization debate kind of first raised its head. And one would have hoped that subsequent to the conference in December where wholesale nationalization is pushed off the table, that one would see a different tone in the way in which the engagement is happening. Given what's happened over the last 72 hours, we don't see a difference in tone. If anything, we are returning back to the period of utmost distrust between the players.
Absolutely, and this is the most concerning part and disappointing part, I think. This does nothing for South Africa as an investment destination. It does nothing for the investors. It certainly does nothing for the shareholders at Amplats, who are looking at this with, I'm sure, distress and enormous concern about what may happen in the near future. Look, I'm quite sure that the parties will find a way through this, but it raises the question of security of tenure. Is it reasonable? Is it rational? Is it productive to kind of raise those threats? I don't think it is. Is it legal? I can't comment, but I think it would be good to have the legal perspective of someone like Peter Leon and others to look at that. Can the DMR make those kind of threats? Do they have what it takes? And if they go ahead, are we not going to have a massive legal battle and tremendous loss of confidence in South Africa?